11:13-ish in the textbook as we're talking about competition. This Friday, we are having lab in Peter Jones 116.
That is the Peter Jones building.
It is. It's like the third one over. One of the old ones. It's a computer lab. You're welcome to bring your own computer if you want to use it and become familiar with the statistical analyses on your own computer. We're going to do two things in class on Friday, and one of them is we're going to do all the problems in homework 4. Okay, like we will work through most of the problems in homework 4.
Is the homework done for that?
No, it's due next Tuesday. Yeah.
Oh, so
Okay.
I don't need to.
No, we're going to do all of it. It's due October 29th, which is next Tuesday. We're going to do the homework in class on Friday. If you want to look at it ahead of the time, awesome. Because then you'll ask great questions and you'll get good answers. That's part of class. Like we'll spend about an hour and a half talking about these different statistical analyses and what variance means and uncertainty, because my hope is that you will design your independent project in a way that you use stats in order to make an answer to your hypothesis. And you may or may not, get enough data to run a good statistical analysis, and we'll talk about that on kind of a one-by-one basis. Because that is another huge purpose of Friday, is to give you an opportunity, again, to figure out what your independent project is going to be for the lab portion of class. And so on Friday, I'm hoping that you can write down for me on a piece of paper what your question is that you want to address in your independent study project. And in doing so, have some type of experimental design where you're going to say, I need to do 10 tests in this location and 10 tests in this location. Or I'm going to make 50 observations over here and 50 observations over here, and then use a t-test, a chi-squared test, and a ANOVA analysis, a linear regression, to see and analyze my data to answer my question. Okay, so we'll talk about the available kind of statistical analyses, and then you can apply that to your experimental design. The reason that I want you to think about your independent project this week is because next week, I want to have the equipment to hand to you that you need so that you can go out in the field, wherever that may be, and start doing your independent project. Okay. And so you got to think about it now so that you're ready to go the first week. Otherwise, you'll find yourself a week behind. And if, again, a good experimental design sometimes can involve several hours of data collection, and it's designed, hopefully, so that you can do it on Fridays. Okay, but you have like 3 or 4 Fridays in which to accomplish your independent project. I want to get you guys thinking about it and going through. Having said that, there is a really interesting aquaculture farm just a couple blocks down the road. And the gentleman at the aquaculture farm has a couple of research questions that he would love to have a student come in and collect some data and answer some stuff for. And so if you are having trouble coming up with an independent study project, I may send you over to Mike, and he can help you with data collection and answering one of his questions. His 2 questions that he has are that he has installed an ozone emitting device in order to help purify his rainwater of bacteria before he sends it into his system, where he has very specific bacteria that he wants growing in his system, and he doesn't want any kind of extraneous organisms coming in. So he's turning on this ozone emitter overnight in order to kill off bacteria in his rainwater tank. He wants to make sure that the ozone stays in the tank, doesn't end up killing the bacteria in his system down the line. And so he wants to know where along the way the ozone level drops off in his water system, and he knows that it's safe. And if he leaves it on all the time, is the ozone still going to dissipate in the system before it kills his good bacteria? So that's one of his questions. His other question is that he is about to start up his large aquaculture tanks, his 550-gallon fish tanks. So this is a system where he grows fish, and the water that the fish poop in is the water that he grows plants in for sale. And then he can sell both the fish and he can sell both the plants. And the plants and the bacteria take up the nutrients from the fish in the water, and then the clean water goes back to the fish. And so it's this really nice aquaponics aquaculture system. He's been doing it small scale, I think, for maybe a year and a half, and he's ready to scale it up. And he wants to monitor the different species of bacteria that grow as he turns the system on. And so if you wanted to go and take samples for bacterial counts, and then we can run some genetics to see what bacteria are present, you would have a nice potential time series of data in the first couple of weeks that he has his system up and running. I mean, you can even do that same type of work, looking at different points in his current system. What are the different species of bacteria and abundances in the fish tank versus going into the plant system versus coming out of the plant. So, those same types of questions, though, you can ask about different freshwater ecosystems. Are the bacteria the same abundance and diversity at this point in the East Fork versus here above and behind a dam, in this lake versus this stream, in different, off the forest versus the prairie? You can do it for soils. Any of the techniques that we have been exposed to this semester, you can ask different research questions and use those same techniques to answer. If you want to go out and count plant diversity, if you want to measure plant competition, if you want to look at invasive species density and how that changes tree or plant or bird composition, those are all possibilities. The third thing, along with Friday. So Friday, we're going to do homework 4 in class. We're going to talk about stats. Friday, I want you to have an initial idea for your independent project. You can let me know. We can talk about it a little bit. And the third thing on Friday is that we're going to talk about writing a scientific paper. Okay? Because the output of your independent project is that you're going to do a presentation to us. And I usually like to ask you to make like a poster so that you have something visual and yet you can stand by it and you don't get freaked out about public speaking. And you have a little poster, you'll present your poster to us in class, in lab, the last Friday of the semester. And then you're also gonna have written up something, a report for me, okay, to see what you did for your independent project. And we are gonna write it as if it were a scientific publication. And so Friday, for the first time in my class, we're gonna read a scientific publication and we're gonna talk about it so that you have an idea of what's in a scientific paper. Okay, I don't expect many of you to have written a publication before, but this is a chance to try it, to get in the gist of it. Definitely, hopefully you guys have written lab reports before, and this is an extension of that, and that you can have some references. We're gonna have an introduction and a materials and methods section, a results section, a discussion, and your kind of references. I have placed on Blackboard a bunch of information about how to write these different sections. So when it's time for you to write your introduction, you can go read about introductions, like some example introductions. You can write about your project. Okay. On Friday, I'm gonna ask you to have read this article about the effects of ocean acidification and temperature on hunting behavior in Port Jackson sharks. So we can talk about what's in a good scientific publication, and you guys can practice looking at how experiments are set up and how experiments are analyzed, again, to get you ready for your independent study. And so, again, about half the class on Friday, and I'll let you guys choose on Friday if you want to start talking about the paper, if you want to start with the stats. And the other half of the class, we're going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to hand you the paper, and I have here for you both the article and the supplementary information. It's super common today that journal articles don't actually give you a ton of space in which to publish your results. And that in explaining yourself, you need some more figures. And that's what we call supplemental information today. Usually it's only available online, and then it's not printed in the physical printout of the publication when it gets put into the physical journal. Although lots of journals today are just solely published online. There's a PDF of this article online for you, associated, I think, with today's class. Please read it before class. Okay. It's not too terribly dense, actually. There's a fair bit of experimental setup, and it talks about how they made and exposed the sharks to these different conditions. And then there's a little bit on stats analysis. And then it does a pretty good job with the results of summarizing the work that's done. To help you while you read, okay, I have an outline that you can fill out as you're reading the article. What is probably going to happen on Friday is that I'll say, hey, okay, find a partner, and you guys are going to summarize the introduction for us. You guys are gonna summarize the materials and methods to us, and I'm gonna ask you guys to talk about figure 1, and you guys talk about figure 2. If you bring this paper filled into class, we will have a great discussion about sharks and ocean acidification. If you don't read the article before class on Friday, it's gonna suck, okay? I can tell you from past experience that if we all read the article at least once before class, we can talk about it. Otherwise, we spend the whole class period explaining the paper to each other. This isn't as fun. I mean, it's informative one way or another, but it helps a ton if you read the paper before class and do some work on the outline. Okay, how's everybody feeling? It's a lot.
Overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's a lot. In preparing for class today, I was like, I think I have used a whole ream of paper getting you ready for class. The advantage to it is that you will walk out of class on Friday with your next homework done, and it'll be done. The advantage to it is that when you walk out of class on Friday, you'll have some experience both reading and thinking about writing a scientific paper. And there is no greater teaching tool than experiencing that. The paper that I've given you is, like I said, it's pretty decent as far as being able to understand it. Like any scientific publication, it has its flaws, and its format does make it difficult to read. It's not like picking up a short story, even if you have good writers. And that's something that I want you to think about as you're reading the paper is how would you write differently? How would you write better than what these authors have done? I read at least 10 different papers trying to pick a different one this semester than the shark paper. And I was like, actually, I think the shark paper was pretty good. As I was reading other papers, and I was like, no. All these interesting thoughts about birds and plants and migrating elephants. They were not good papers. Back there published. Okay. Take your time. All right, come to class on Friday. Come to class on Friday knowing that you'll get something out of it and knowing that the next few weeks are going to be more on your honor system as you go and can spend time on lab. So it's a big push to get you somewhere, hopefully pretty good. Do you guys have any questions? All right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about competition then. As our topics in class. And competition experiments are things that can make great independent study projects too. If you want to manipulate the number of plants in a plot on the prairie, you can do that. If you want to do something in the greenhouse where you examine intra and interspecies competition, lots of times those types of experiments can be really interesting. You can measure them in a lot of different ways other than just plant biomass. You can do stuff with soil microbes. You can do stuff with soil conditions. But we are talking about intra-species competition. Today, we're probably going to focus on that in terms of the consequences of competition for individuals and populations, and then what causes that. Like what causes reduced reproduction in fecundity. Okay, like what is the underlying mechanism here? There's also a really interesting thing that happens when you get small population sizes. And so we tend to associate competition, interactions, and problems for populations at high population numbers and densities. But when you get really small population densities and abundances, you can get another problem of competition, which we call the Ali effect. And so we'll talk about that today. I don't think so, but if we have time today, we'll talk about niches and the interactions of competition between species when two species have the same niche. And that gets us into the next flavor of competition, which is in chapter 13 of our textbook, which is the competition between different species rather than individuals of the same population like we're talking about today. Okay, so we talked on Thursday about a definition for competition. And we said that intra-species competition is when you have competition of members of the same species, like the birds we saw on the first slide today and the anemone fish we just saw. We have these hippos, which are in an aggressive stance and definitely have competition with each other. The cause of this particular picture could be a bunch of different things, whether it's mating or food territory or just simply space, personal space issues. Hippos have trouble with that too. They're more deadly than crocodiles in Africa. Leave the hippos alone. Okay. Competition, of course, is when one organism uses a resource at the expense of another. Because that organism ate the food, it is not available for someone else. That's competition. It is density dependent, and it is one of the density dependent controls of population size and population growth. And that the higher the density of the population, the more individuals in a given area, the more intense competition will become for said resources in that available area. And that as competition increases due to density, the consequences of competition will become more severe, will also increase. And we see this kind of across the board, plants, animals, and vertebrates, that the more competition you have, the greater the consequences to the organism. Having said that, though, in order for competition to be a factor, you actually have to have limiting resources and high density in most cases. We'll talk about that exception of the Ali effect today. But at low population densities, competition is not a factor for individuals or populations because competition is less and there aren't as intense consequences. On Thursday, I talked about two general types of competition and then a couple different kind of expressions of that as well. And so I talked about scramble and contest competition. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can summarize the differences between scramble and contest competition.
It's like everybody gets equally stuff, like resources and everything. And contest is when they're like fighting for it. Others get it more than.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, they don't necessarily need to compete with that zebra is just eating this grass and that zebra can't eat that. It's not like they're actually competing with people, but
There's a limited resource. Or if they're going after the same bug.
right. Some of the contests are like aggression, parasitism, and that means like bird stops here like with a piece of bread, and another bird jumps down and just like takes that piece of bread. Like, you see that? Like that? Yeah, takes that.
Leptoparasitism.
I like that word.
It's
Kleptoparasitism.
Okay, it sounded like you guys got it. What is scramble competition?
Individuals are affected equally.
Right, individuals are affected equally in their competition. And so a herd of grazing antelope is kind of the classic scramble competition example. Every organism is scrambling to find their resources, and because there are lots of them, everybody has less access to food. What is contest competition?
The winner and a loser?
There's a winner and a loser. And again, this often comes when we talk about mates and predation events. And again, kind of less than just like grazing events in terms of predation. We'll talk about grazing as a form of predation. But that their organisms will gain access to resource at the expense of other individuals. Some individuals will get enough in contest competition and other individuals will lose out. The consequences are not equal across the population as in scramble competition.
Is there like, do they actually fight for it?
Sometimes they do. Like here, we have our flamingos that are actually fighting for mates, and that's the aggressive expression of contest competition. Sometimes it's super indirect, right? Like you have your like roots that are competing underground. It's not like the roots are like firing missiles at each other.
So like,
but they are in contest competition with each other.
So like the organism that have better traits, it's also
Exactly. So this plays into natural selection. This plays into evolutionary adaptation, and that the winners of competition will gain more resources, either scramble or contest, and they will pass on more of their genes. They will increase their proportion of the population with their gene type. And those that lose out, just not individually, but also on the genetic level, and then the population changes because you lose some of that diversity. This is one reason why, in order for a mutation to have a consequence in evolution or natural selection, it has to be tied to a trait or an expression where it interacts with the environment or with other organisms. That mutation just does nothing. It doesn't change traits or behavior, then there's nothing for natural selection. There's nothing for competition to work with. Cool, okay. All right, we're gonna talk about competition consequences first, and there are three basic ones, but on the big picture, I want you to recognize that competition has consequences for biodiversity and for populations. First and foremost, competition affects growth and development of individuals. And because it affects growth and development, it then affects survival of those individuals. And as a result, it can affect population abundance and population growth and population density. So competition has an individual effect. Because individuals are affected by competition, it has population consequences. Its impacts are so obviously density dependent. The more individuals there are, the more intense competition will be, the more will be affected in their terms of growth and development, and thus survival and population. We can look at kind of the different levels of biodiversity, these different terms that we've been introducing throughout the semester in terms of the effects of competition. And so on an individual organism basis, and I always tend towards animals, I apologize, plants are organisms too, as are bacteria. On an individual basis, competition can be negative if you lose contest competition and you are pushed out of a territory. If you're denied food or mate, then competition is negative for you. But if you are the winner of contest competition, competition is fine. Competition boosts your survival and reproduction. You get access to more resources and mates. Likewise, if competition enhances your survival as a population because those individuals with bad genes, maladapted traits are weeded out, that can be really beneficial for you as a population and as an individual because you'll get the good genes in the future due to competition. You'll be better adapted. In terms of population sizes, again, competition can be positive or negative. When competition is dealing with organisms at carrying capacity, it tends to depress population size. It tends to cause a decrease. But over the long term, competition should improve the traits and the fitness of a population for its ecosystem, and it should boost population numbers. You should become better adapted. You should be able to increase your overall carrying capacity due to the effects of competition. And so the kind of spatial and time scales here for competition are definitely interactive. When we think about functional, genetic, species biodiversity, competition tends to be a huge winner. And that competition promotes biodiversity. Competition, we're going to see, results in species adaptation and adaptive radiation. All these different types of birds that come from one kind of ancestor. That's due to competition causing them to specialize. That creates genetic diversity. That enforces species diversity, species barriers. It leads to greater functional diversity, greater roles, that different numbers of roles that species accomplish within an ecosystem.
How does it increase biodiversity?
So with a competition, then there's a force that's going to push organisms to be different from each other. And that enforces biodiversity at all the different levels, genetic, individual, population, species, ecosystem-wise. And that in order to avoid competition, you have to be different, which directly equals biodiversity. And it can be at any of these different levels. This kind of ecosystem big competition benefit is going to become more apparent when we talk about different species competing with each other than what we're talking about now is really on the kind of individual population consequences. Does that make sense? Okay, so keep this big picture in mind. In general, competition, it can be really bad if you lose competition on an individual basis, but in general, over the long term and the big ecosystem scale, competition is something that promotes biodiversity, that leads to new species, leads to new traits and new alleles, leads to new functional abilities within an ecosystem. Okay, all right. There are 3 basic consequences to organisms from competition. And again, these are directly related to competition with members of your same species. We see that competition reduces individual growth rates. Okay, competition reduces individual growth rates. I'm going to give you a couple examples of each of these on the next set of slides here. Competition increases individual mortality rate. It affects your survival. And finally, competition affects individual reproduction and fecundity. So your opportunities for reproduction are affected by your competition stress, and the number of offspring you have and successfully raise, that fecundity term, is directly related to competition. It reduces your growth rate, it reduces your survival rate, it reduces your reproductive rate. And so again, competition is kind of bad on an individual basis. The more of you there are, the more competition, the more likely you are to die young without having any babies at a smaller size. What's up? If that was how we were like grading ourselves on success. Okay. Let's talk about the first one. So we see that competition reduces individual growth rates. And our first example is in plants. This is a white clover plant. And they artificially put more plants in a pot, up to like 260 plants in a pot. I don't know how big these pots were. But they artificially increased the density of these plants so that in doing so, they increased competition within the same species of this little white clover guy. And what they saw was that increasing density, increasing competition led to lower weight per plant. It affected the growth of the plant. And that the fewer there were, the bigger they grew. Okay. And so that's an inverse relationship. Okay, the fewer, the bigger, the more, the less they grew. And so sometimes you just got to kind of keep that in mind, that it makes total sense. Okay, if you're competing, you will have less access to nutrients, you will grow less. Okay. But lots of times we think that the more of you there are, the bigger you will get, and that is not true in competition. Okay, it's the other thing. What happens in this case is definitely an example of resource limitation. There's a limited amount of nutrients in water per plot. There's a limited amount of sunlight that you can gain access to. The more of you there are competing for that sunlight and nutrients in water, the less you will get individually. The less that you get for those basic resources, the less you can grow. And that's exactly what we see in plants. It follows through with most types of organisms that increased density leads to lower individual growth. That you may have a lot of them, but they are smaller than they would be at a given age, than they would be in a lower density situation. My next example shows the same types of growth rates. Hopefully it's steelhead trout. Nope, we're going to talk about tadpoles first. Here we have tadpoles, so our baby amphibians, and we place them at different densities. They had, pots, little ponds that had 10, 20, or 40 little tadpoles in them. And they looked to see what happened in terms of growth and development for the individual tadpoles. And again, they saw the same inverse relationship, that increasing the number of tadpoles decreased the growth rate in terms of grams that they added per day and how big they got in total at the end. Again, it's a really clear example of resource limitation, that because you have more tadpoles, they each get less food. and thus they're each going to grow smaller at the same age. Okay. We have two other graphs here that show us the percent of time they spent being active and their relative body length. And so how did those two things change with competition?
They had to be way more active to be able to get food.
Exactly.
Because there's more.
With more competitors, you have to spend more time looking for and getting access to resources. So it ends up affecting your energy use and your overall metabolism. What else changed?
Body length,
And how did it change?
they got longer.
So why did they get longer?
Because they had to swim more.
Yeah, there was a selective pressure for them to swim more. And so their developmental plasticity comes into effect. And that with the same genotype under different conditions of competition, you can get slightly different body morphologies to the point that you can actually measure. The other thing I want you to notice about this is that definitely for body length, these arrow bars totally overlap. Okay, this is probably not a statistically significant difference like we see definitely for activity rates and for overall birth rates. So competition is having an effect here. That's probably not statistically significant in terms of changing body. Okay, so in this case, we have this inverse relationship between growth rate and competition, definitely due to limited resources. Their behavior changed due to competition in order to try to adapt to competition, and their development changed too. And so again, recognize that competition is one of these factors that can shape an individual's life history. And just like predation, we're going to do the same thing too. Okay, my next example, I would say, is that we're going to talk about now the second impactor of competition. It can increase your mortality rate. It can reduce your survival rate. And so I have printed out this lovely image from our textbook. I'm going to ask you, each of you can answer the questions, but you can definitely talk to as many people in class as you would like to in order to answer the questions about our steelhead trout. I hope I have another one. Maybe I wanted you to work in groups, Carl.
It does say names.
All right, Carl, you gotta work. You can write on your own paper. You can turn in one paper together. Carl and Amy must turn in one paper together. In steelhead trout, we have a more complicated experiment. We have looking at survival and how many of the total proportion were alive after 8 weeks under different food densities and under different competition densities. And so in answering the questions, it'll kind of guide you through looking at the data a little bit. And we have
This is identity and then and then there's less competition. Right.
That's right. The first question just asked about the first little part of the graph.
It's hard getting like this graph.
So the
Kind
question,
of look at one at a time.
yeah, the questions ask you like, just look at the first one to begin with, and then it'll kind of ask you this, so you're trying to put them together. So answering the questions definitely can help you interpret the data.
There's still a decline versus time drastic. Yeah. The very small slope. Slope change maybe?
What should we put B? That's just how I did it.
We only have identity. You said here, I think it is the whole. You didn't just talk about this. You see that? You just want to answer everything.
I know.
You got like. So excited.
Take another couple minutes, we'll talk about it. We can- I did came home yesterday and I'm taking another standardized test. And I guess I have to, I don't know, he was like, I have to take it all over again tomorrow because I didn't finish and then it wouldn't save. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, it kind of doesn't surprise me with my kid that like gets distracted easily. I'm sure he was just like,
I didn't have no time.
yeah, exactly. And I'm like, well, what did your teacher say? You know, like you get a 0 if you, he's like, I was just starting the last question. And I was like, so you get like a 0 if you don't finish? Like, couldn't you just have typed in like, yes, and like,
Something blue.
yeah, exactly. And like, I don't know. I'm expecting to hear lots more about it today. The same thing, like, what if you answer the thing ahead of time? You have to re-answer it. Okay, let's chat about our steelhead trout. It's kind of interesting from several perspectives what is happening with fish in different densities and under different food abundances. And so they had them in artificial competition with each other in a couple different scales, and then they were measuring them in terms of survival, proportion remaining, as well as their growth. Okay, the two things that we have talked about thus far. It's interesting from a environmental perspective, like what happens when you get big population abundances of fish, like how do they interact with one another? This is also very interesting from a farming perspective, and that one of the things we want to do is raise more fish in farms. And what is the right density to have them at, and how much food do they need in order to not have them kill each other and eat each other, and then also get them to grow big fast so that we can sell them fast. And so there are some reasons why you might do these complex experiments, other than just because you wanted to know. Okay, so question 1A, how does mortality differ for just the high density experiment under low, medium, and high food abundance?
Mortality rate increases as vitality does.
Yeah, the answer to the first little question, like what is happening in this graph? It's one little part of it.
As there's less food, mortality rate increases.
Right, why?
There's more competition.
Right, there's more competition, yeah. And so there's a consequence to growth, but there's a consequence to overall survival too, okay? And that the more intense competition, when you have more competitors for less food, you see that, like 10% of them survive to 8 weeks compared to 90% if you give them more food, more resources, and reduce competition. The second question then asks you, how did the results here change when we changed the overall density of fish in the tank?
The low density has stayed pretty consistent and slowly kind of tapers off with low food.
Yeah.
Or with medium density, the low food kind of descended a little bit more drastically than the other two that had.
Right. At low density, you can give them not much food and they're still okay. They're still getting enough resources. Competition is still not enough to affect overall survival rates. Like there is an effect, but it's not nearly as dramatic as the differences between the food treatments here. At the medium density, it looks like under the low food treatment, you hit the tipping point in terms of competition affecting survival. And that something in here, in this combination of resources and density, is enough to really start to affect survival. But again, it's not as severe as it is for the low food density at more competitors, more fish per tank.
What is the average lifespan?
So steelhead trout should live somewhere between 3 to 5 years.
Oh, okay, so then it's not just they're dying because they're getting old.
No, they're pretty long-lived fish. Yeah, they should. There should be a high mortality rate when they're young because they're eaten by something. But in this type of situation, like this is a tank and there are not predators, and so their only interaction is this resource competition with each other. Okay. The second questions asked you about the effects on growth rates. Okay. So 2A, how does the growth rate, the body length, differ in the high density treatment under the low, the medium, and the high food resources? Yeah, you get that kind of opposite result when we look at growth rates than we did with survival. It was the low density one that we got similar results with when we look at survival, but in terms of growth, whoever survives here is only getting so big under competition. Okay, and again, you have to kind of keep in mind that we're only looking at the survivors that made it to 8 weeks in terms of our experiment. But at high density, you can give them lots of food and they still won't grow. Okay, they are not getting enough. It affects their individual growth rate. Okay, how do those results translate to our medium and our low density tanks for body length? The last question.
Low density, they high body weight.
Yeah. Yeah. At low density, then you really start to see almost a greater effect of competition on growth rate, because now you can see that there really is an effect in terms of food. That didn't really affect how many survived, but it really affected the individual growth rate. It was a big experiment. This type of data presentation is not uncommon in scientific publications where they like throw it at you and they're like, hey, this is what we saw. And then you're supposed to interpret it. And so practicing helps a lot. But what it shows us in terms of the effects of competition is that the trends are the same, that there's decreased survival at more intense competition, whether it's the actual number or the food that's causing it, there's decreased survival rate. But the actual reason why is a little bit different in each instance. Are they competing? You know, what is the competitive factor? Is it numbers or is it food abundance? You can get the same results. But the kind of thing can be more specific to the particular condition. Is everybody with me? Okay. All right. So if you were going to grow steelhead trout, what would you choose in terms of stocking density and food?
Low density. Yep.
Low density, lots of food. Okay. Guess what? That's expensive and not very productive. And so,
Medium density.
yeah, there has to be some kind of trade-off, okay? You know, maybe high density, high food actually gets you the most fish at the saleable amount. Here you're gonna have big fish, but there won't be that many of them. Okay, so yeah, it might be some kind of trade-off. And again, like if you throw a ton of food at just a few fish, like you're gonna spend a whole lot of money per fish. Versus if you throw a ton of food at a ton of fish, you'll get a ton of fish back. But you can't cheap out then on the food, or you'll end up with less. Okay, turn your paper in so I can give you some credit for being here today. Yay! Some actual participation credit.
I didn't get last credit on Friday.
Probably not,
I
but
was there though for like 40 minutes.
I know. I was like, you did it. I know you did it. Find it. I will think of some ways in which I think almost everybody has missed one lab or another this semester. I'll think of some ways in which you guys can get some of that back. I don't think it's going to be the difference between an A or a B for you guys.
I had a feeling Carl and I went to the front lot and you guys just like drove all the way back. We should possibly.
Right, I know, like you guys came in
And then I was like, well, if anybody else shows up, hey.
I know we're going to be like gone in the field. Although I was up at the main gate with my.
Yeah, make sure you did. You sent me an address.
Oh, yeah.
That took me to the other end. You sent me an address that took me to the complete opposite other end.
Oh.
And that's why I was waiting there.
That's what I thought. You were like, oh, I'm by the park.
Yeah.
And I was like,
And they were like, 890, whatever. And then I went there, went there, and I was like,
But the trunk didn't shut. Yeah, the trunk didn't.
well, I should have went to the school with the email, but I figured.
That's okay.
it happened.
I walked around though, really nice.
I know, it is really nice
No,
there.
birds
I loved
chirping.
it. Yeah, it's cool. It's a really nice spot.
Just follow the turkey vultures that we're at.
I'm just sitting there.
It was a great day to sit outside too.
Yeah.
I have
It's
some
fun.
ideas. Like I think almost everybody's Mr. Collins. There has to be some way to make up a lab. And like again, like for you, I was like, I know that you were there. Okay. All right. Well, let me think on it. I have like I'm aware of this, and I'm like thinking about it. I don't have a good resolution yet. It is in my brain somewhere. Okay. So again, another example of this increased individual mortality rate, reduced survival. We can look at it in invertebrates. This is monarch butterfly larvae, and we put different densities of eggs, 0 through 5, on a plant. And then we see that when we increase the density of eggs, we have fewer larvae that survive. And again, that same inverse relationship between competition and survival or growth rates of organisms. And again, they're competing with each other here, definitely in terms of resource use. What is interesting is that you see it's not, they have a line on here, but they don't show us the R-squared value in the kind of fit of this particular line. But you notice that the data kind of go like this, and there's this big kind of jump here at the end. And this is what we can consider this feedback loop, and we're going to talk about as self-thinning. In that as you have the competitors die off from competition, the survivors have greater access to resources. And as a result, they'll do even better. Okay, their survival and growth is enhanced by competition. It's that idea that they have won the contest and they're actually going to do better than just straight prediction would say. And that's this like feedback loop that as more of you die from competition, the survivors will do better, they'll grow and reproduce better. And then again, you get these kind of cycles in populations as well as these not completely straight lines in relationships. Okay, my last example here of increased mortality has to do with both plants as well as with vertebrates. Again, we're looking at a horseweed on the top, and we see this brown trout. And for both of them, we're looking at the weight of the plant here and versus density. And we see this, that the average weight per plant goes way down the more of them that there are. In this particular time series, we also see that there's, in this case, they have started with a set number of individuals. And as they die off due to competition, there are fewer individuals at the next time point. And those individuals then are growing bigger because of greater access to resources. So these graphs are showing us the two things together. Again, they're allowing you to see them one-on-one. And it's kind of nice again in that they put in a starting number of fish in the pond. That number was reduced due to increased mortality because of competition, but then those survivors grew bigger. And as they lost even more members of the population, they got even bigger over time in terms of the fish that were in the pond. And this is that idea of self-thinning that I just mentioned, that increasing biomass and growth of the survivors happens after this density-dependent competition-driven mortality. That the population competition serves as a thinning process to promote the survival of the survivors. Okay. Again, it's this idea that you might throw out 1 million eggs. Competition of that larvae is going to produce a surviving population of those individuals best fit to compete for resources. Okay. And because they win competition, then they grow better and survive better. Okay. It's that ever continuing feedback loop. Because I grew and survived better as a juvenile, I'll do better as an adult, my offspring will do better in the next generation. And here, it's like you have a predation event happening where you have individuals of the population being removed due to mortality. It's being thinned, but in this case, it's competition. It's interaction with your own species members that causes the increased mortality that benefits the survivors. Okay, cool. All right, the last thing that competition causes is a reduction in reproduction and fecundity. And we have examples here from vertebrates, and we're looking at these gorgeous harp seals, which are these wonderfully plump, fat little individual roly-poly vertebrates when they are just coming out of their kind of summer feeding and into their mating processes. They're all looking really great. What we see, though, is that if you wait to reproduce, that there is a trade-off in terms of population density and when you begin to reproduce. Okay, and that if your population density is very high, your first age of reproduction is delayed. It happens later. Okay, and we're talking about somewhere from 4.5 all the way up to 6.5 years. Like that's 2 reproductive cycles that are delayed because of high population density. It affects the amount of reproduction for the individual and then as a population as a whole. Because fewer individuals are reproducing, you can stabilize your population size. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You'd almost think that more seals equals more mating, though.
But it doesn't. Right. It means that the females that are trying to grow to the size to be successful for reproduction aren't getting there. And so they're
too long to get there.
Yeah, and so it takes longer to build up the resources for them to be able to invest in reproducing. The males are like, whatever. It's really about females. Okay. And again, we're looking at like female reproduction here. The males will jump in whenever they can. But again, it's size dependent for males too in terms of mating opportunities. And if it takes them longer to get to the dominant size, then their average age of first reproduction will be delayed too. On the other side, we see that the number of mature females giving birth, which is on the y-axis, is dependent upon the population cohort that was 2 years old or older from the previous year. And so that if you have more reproductive females in your population, let's see. If you have more females reproductive in your population, fewer of you actually give birth. Okay. If there are less reproductive females in your population, more of you are able to give birth that year. It affects the number of offspring that are produced too. It affects you individually as to what age you start reproducing, and the population density affects whether or not you reproduce at all that year. Okay. Part of this time delay. Part of it is that even if you were of age and able to reproduce, under high population densities, fewer of you choose to do that. And this is just giving birth. It's not successfully raising an offspring. And so it affects that fecundity amount, the number of offspring that are actually produced. Okay. So we have high resource competition, delays maturity, the body weight necessary, which is what we see in our first graph. The later date of reproduction affects the overall fecundity of the population as a whole. Because you're going to grow more slowly as you have more reproductive movements. And so you end up with this inverse relationship of the percent of females birthing in the population to the density of the population the year before. If the density was low, you have a higher percentage. If the density is high, you have a lower percentage of females giving birth. Really common across populations that somehow populations start to slow down reproduction when they get very intense competition due to higher densities. And the question is always like, why? Like, how do they sense that they're at high population densities and thus they slow down reproduction? Because that's exactly what the population wants to do in terms of hitting and staying at carrying capacity and not overshooting. Does that make sense? Okay, I think I have a plant example of reduced reproduction and fecundity in plants. We've got soybeans and a glasswort in terms of the plants that we're looking at in the graphs. We see that increasing the plants in the area leads to lower seed production. Again, this inverse relationship due to competition. So the seed production drops off the higher the density. And we see that we have this, again, inverse relationship between population density in our glasswort and the number of seeds that they produce, their overall fecundity. Resource competition has a consequence in that you won't have the resources to support as much reproductive effort. That serves to stabilize your population size. It serves to remove density-dependent controls by stabilizing population. It's negative on an individual basis, but it's very positive on the population side. Okay. There are several mechanisms then that cause reduced growth, that cause reduced survival, that cause reduced reproduction. And so, like, what is actually happening inside the organisms that results in less growth, less reproduction, greater mortality? The first thing that we clearly recognize is that competition causes stress. And we know this in our own lives, right? Like when I'm like, hey, I'm going to grade your individual projects in a competition, contest. Whoever has the best project gets the highest grade. You guys would all just like seize up, okay? I'm not going to do that. But like, competition induces stress, and there are consequences to stress, okay? When you're in a stressful situation, we have hormones that actively suppress growth and reproduction because you need to be putting resources into responding to the stress rather than growing and reproducing. And these hormonal changes on a physiological individual basis cause reduced growth, reduced reproductive effort, that have those consequences we just talked about. Very often we see that stress results in a depressed immune system, and thus when you are exposed to disease, you will not mount the same immune response, and as a result, you will increase mortality. And so here we talk about disease being a density-dependent controller of population size and growth. It does so in a couple different ways. And this is one of them, in that increased competition for resources suppresses your immune system, and that has consequences for your ability to fight disease, directly leads to increased mortality rates. Very often we see that stress during pregnancy leads to an increased rate of miscarriage and less lactation, particularly in mammals. And so in this way, competition can reduce reproduction effort and fecundity because it causes miscarriage, because it means that offspring are less likely to get the resources they need. The other thing that's very interesting is that both for plants and animals, we see that stress is communicated from individual to individual, oftentimes through pheromones. These released volatile compounds then that are smelled or absorbed by other individuals in the population. And that can cause hormonal changes in the individuals that receive the hormone signal to the point that they reduce their reproductive effort as a result of those hormonal changes, or they reproduce their overall growth rate. They delay that age of maturation in first birth. A great example of this is that female mice in high density populations produce different pheromones in their urine. And when their offspring receive that pheromone signal, they delay their maturation and suppress the movement into puberty and becoming sexually reproductive themselves. And in that way, stress of being in a high competitive situation helps reduce competition by reducing the number of individuals that are going to be added to the population. And so the stress is bad individually, but it benefits the population. It's pretty cool. These types of experiments that look at the physiological mechanism of competition that actually results in changed growth, survival, and reproductive effort are really interesting because we can measure things like decreased reproduction. We can measure things like increased mortality, and then it's like competition causes it, but like why? Okay. One of the things that competition can do is that it triggers stress. And stress causes these hormonal changes, which then physiologically can affect growth, survival, reproduction. Okay. The other thing that competition does is it increases dispersal. And dispersal is this movement of individuals out from a given area into new territory or adjoining territory. And dispersal in competition can happen in two ways. And the first one is that individuals, leave the population. And it depends on which individuals leave the population as to how competition plays out for the individuals in the population. And so if you have high competition for resources, as often happens in our large mammal predator prides, like the lions at the bottom picture here, you see that the adults in the population will push out the sub-adults. They see the juvenile organisms as competitors for mates and resources, and they drive them out of the herd. They drive them out of the pride. Okay, like we've seen this all in all the African documentaries. You see the big male lion rolling up in there, fighting the current lion, and somebody wins access to the resources. As the male lion cubs reach sexual maturation, their parents, both males and females, drive them away, okay, because they're competitors for resources. They don't want to feed them anymore. You gotta leave, okay?
How do you stay part of a pride then? And how do prides build? Is it mostly consistently like a lead male, lead female?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and so usually what happens is that resource dependent, one or more females will mate with the lead male. And usually there's just one male, sometimes there's two that are often brothers that are genetically related. And so they're essentially working together for the benefit of their genes to maintain themselves in the population. But how many females reproduce in any given year is resource dependent, it's competition dependent. When they're pushing out subadults, that's the male and the females that are already adults trying to ensure that they have resources to raise next year's offspring. They're like, we're done with you, you're on your own, you gotta find your own territory. And so they'll push out the subadults, the juveniles. And in that way, under those same resource conditions, the pride should maintain a stable size year to year. Given more resources, more females will breed, the population can grow. But if there'll ever be this fluctuation of the individuals that are in the pride, okay? It won't be like, because you were born in this pride, you get to stay in the pride. No, because I'm already an adult in the pride, I get to stay in the pride, and I will have more cubs next year. Yeah.
I think one of our earlier classes were trying to figure methods to estimate population and stuff.
Yeah.
Increased dispersal due to competition, can that be a big factor?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it can really affect your population estimates. And that, how do you measure dispersal?
Yeah.
And that could really cause complications.
So I guess you have to know the factors for competition before you begin that.
Yeah, and you have to take that into account when you're going to go to do a measurement. And so you might follow a population during a time when you know they're not dispersing.
Resource abundance and stuff like that.
This movement of subadults out does not prevent overpopulation. Like, we're still going to have babies born the next year. Those subadults are still going to be trying to live in the same territory. It doesn't change the overall population problem, but it helps the juveniles get out and establish their own territory, potentially lead to overpopulation, but do their own thing. And it really prevents inbreeding, helps with genetic diversity. And that you won't have daughters mating with fathers. You won't have daughters mating with brothers. They tend to go in different directions.
So it's not just a male that leaves, it can be a female.
Oh, yeah, the females will leave
because
too.
of the resources and because there's too many
Yep.
females and only a certain amount of males.
Yep.
Christian flow.
Like the thing in The Lion King where like Nala goes out like searching for resources, like that happens. Okay, it seems like a story trope, but it might work.
So they're naturally more juveniles. It's usually the older ones pick a pride, stick with a pride. They've been there for a while because they've been reproducing more
Yes,
and
and
offering more.
yeah, and so once you can establish yourself as an adult in a territory in these types of species situations, then you tend to stick there because that's your resource space. You have won the contest for resources. Okay. In other populations, it's not the juveniles that leave, it's the adults that will leave. Okay. And so we've just been talking about the pack kind of herd mentality where you drive out purposefully the juveniles in order to prevent competition. Sometimes it's the adults that leave, okay? And it's the life history of the organism and the species as to who disperses when competition is in play can vary a little bit, okay? And so sometimes it's the adults that leave from a population, particularly when resources are abundant. They see the neighboring forest plot and they say, that's a beautiful acorn tree in terms of these adult squirrels. Let me go live there. And there will be less resource competition. And so sometimes it's the adults that disperse. This happens a lot in birds, and that the birds will move into a new territory. Here it happens in squirrels as well. Because the adults leave, then the population can really stabilize. We're expanding the overall territory and resource base so that more adults can reproduce and the juveniles are not asked to leave. They can be defended by their parents. They can be better taken care of by their parents. They can take a piece of the parent territory. Okay. This type of adult dispersal helps to expand the overall population territory and range that the whole species encompasses. It increases carrying capacity by expanding range. And it can aid in local population persistence. If you lose a bit of the territory, then you just expanded into new territory. So in terms of conservation management, having adults that disperse from a species is more resilient to habitat destruction and climate change than if it's the juveniles that leave and the adults that are very resistant to change. So just recognize that who leaves and disperses in the population has different effects. Okay, if the subadults leave, doesn't really help with the overall population. It definitely benefits the juveniles. But if you really want to stabilize the population, then the adults need to be willing to leave too. And again, that's entirely life history and species dependent as to who does the dispersal. But competition can cause dispersal, and in doing so, it affects survival, mortality, individual growth rates.
So what are the benefits to having the juveniles leaving early?
The benefits is just to the adults that stay. They don't have to compete with their offspring, and it prevents inbreeding. Yeah. Okay. The last thing I want to mention today is that competition can affect social behavior. The more dense the population, you can get more aggression. You can get intolerance. You can see dominance appear where it wasn't present before. And this then limits the total numbers in the area. If you have a dominant breeding pair, that affects the reproduction of other reproductive individuals in the population. They might be able to reproduce, but they don't because of social behavior. Okay, like we talked about with the lionesses. The other lionesses can reproduce, but they don't due to this type of response to competition. to the social behavior. These are naked mole rats. They are naked mole rats. Their name says. In this instance, there's usually one dominant breeding female, and she will actively kill off other pups that are produced by other females when density is very high. But if density is low, sometimes those other females can manage to raise their litters on the side. She's less vigilant. Okay, we'll talk about territoriality when we come to class on Thursday. Okay.